Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Storytelling for Presenters, the second session, Storytelling. How appropriate. My name's Ian Keeling. I'm going to be taking you through this today. During your first session, you work with Andrea Sampson. And before we get started, we want to just do a couple of quick logistical things to make sure that you're set up right. I understand we have a few new people here today. Welcome to the sessions. So what you want to do is right now, you should see our deck. You should see the word Storytelling for Presenters, Session 2, Storytelling. If you go up to the top of your screens, you're going to see a little thing that you can click on. When you click on that, you should see on View Options. If you click on View Options, you should see a slide scroll down. And if you scroll down, then you should be able to see side-by-side view. That's the thing that you want to engage. So click on side-by-side view. Now you should see the deck and me in some ratio. There's a slide bar between those two images. If you want to slide that slide bar over to the center of your screen, you should end up with the deck taking up 50% of your view on one half, and then me taking up the other half. That's the ideal ratio. Adjust it to however you see. All right, so let's jump right into session 2. And if we're going to do that, well then let's review what we covered in session 1. For those of you who weren't here, don't worry, we're going to get you caught up. So in session 1, Andrea discussed with you how we'll take an idea that we want to convey to the world, but how we can create an impact with that idea by using storytelling. And we offered you a model in order to do that. We also discussed the importance of the audience and understanding their needs, and also what you feel the purpose of your presentation might be. We went over a couple of things that presentations might achieve. When you do a presentation, your presentation might have one purpose or it might have multiple purposes. And finally, we talked about that core idea, what, how, and why. And we're going to be using that framework to frame your messages, your ideas going forward throughout these sessions. We also gave you 2 homework assignments. The first assignment was, we asked you what your expectations for this program might be. Hopefully you wrote a few of those down. Feel free to add to that list as we progress through the weeks, because you might find that in our 3rd or 4th session, you suddenly realize, oh, I'd like to work on this. And we can hopefully achieve those expectations both in these webinars, but also in our group coaching sessions. And then finally, your homework assignment. We asked you to create a 1 to 2 minute story and then share that story with someone else. Now we're going to use those stories in our upcoming homework assignment. And if you didn't get a chance to create those stories or you weren't here for our first session, don't worry. We'll combine the 2 homeworks together. However, we are going to want you to bring those stories to our group coaching next week, because we're going to use those and share them with the whole group. So that's what happened last time. Let's dive into storytelling. And if we're going to do that, well, let's start with something simple. What exactly is a story? Now, there's all kinds of ways that storytelling gets defined. There's all kinds of ways we might think of stories. Here's a simple definition. A story is a retelling of events. Could be factual, could be fictional, in a related manner so that the listeners of that story are able to understand the impact to the characters in that story and their motivations involved and how they get affected by the events that happen to them. Now, what do stories do? Well, they do all kinds of things, but let's start with something we might not think of, which is how stories actually affect us physically. So, storytelling has a profound impact on our brains. As a matter of fact, there's been a bunch of paradigm shifts throughout history. Paradigm shifts are things like the Gutenberg Bible in the 14th century, or going back further, the invention of writing. These are events that completely changed human history and allowed us to move forward. A paradigm shift that a lot of people might not be aware of is called the cognitive revolution. It happened about 20 to 30,000 years ago. And one of the main things that happened during this cognitive revolution was human beings began telling stories. And this had such a huge impact on human history. It allowed us for the first time to take the ideas that we wanted to convey to people and not only convey them to the people who were alive with us at that time, but those ideas could be passed on through the generations to our descendants, allowing human progress to explode. And when that happened, it actually had a pretty big effect on the way our brains got wired. So let's say you want to present an idea. When you present an idea, or maybe a statistic, a piece of data, whatever the heck it is, your brain, two parts of your brain fire off. Wernicke's area, which works on language comprehension, and Broca's area, which works on language processing. That's pretty good. But if we take that same piece of data, that same statistic, that same idea, and we wrap it inside a story, well, then we have a remarkable effect. 7 different parts of our brain go off. Now, I'm not going to go into all these parts of our brain, mainly because I am not a scientist, but I do want you to pay close attention to the one at the bottom of your screen there, the sensory cortex. Because if we can engage our senses, especially if we can engage all 5 senses, well, now our brains go into hyperdrive and we're that much more likely to retain our ideas. We're going to talk about how you engage those senses a little later on when we get into the storytelling structure. So, what does this do in terms of our ability to retain the information that we're putting inside that story? Well, it turns out that when these 7 areas fire off, we end up with neural coupling happening. We have mirroring, we have cortex activity that's increased, but more importantly, dopamine gets released. And that's the thing that makes us feel good. We enjoy telling stories. We enjoy listening to stories. And because of that, we retain so much more information. As a matter of fact, we retain as much as 60 to 70% of the information that was inside that story. Not only that, stories have a profound effect on us physically, but they can accomplish a few other things. So, one huge thing that stories do is they create context for your ideas or for your information, or even just something as simple as the statistic. And by creating that context, it helps us understand the data. It helps us understand the idea. And so that means we're that much more likely to hold on to that idea. It also allows us to develop relationships with our listeners, which is so huge, especially at the beginning of presentations. We want to really grab people's interest. And by building those relationships, even if your listeners haven't directly experienced the exact story that you're telling or the story you're sharing about someone else, they've probably lived a similar experience. And now we've created empathy and we've pulled people in. Not only that, but it creates a shortcut to explaining. Often, if we introduce an idea through storytelling, by the time we actually get to the idea when we present it clearly, or the piece of data or the statistic, we don't have to explain. We don't have to do a deep dive because the story already gave context to us. So it actually allows us to save time, and it allows us to be more efficient in the way we present those ideas. And then finally, it can help create connectivity between unrelated concepts, or more importantly, concepts that are seemingly unrelated. I mentioned when I introduced myself in the first session that my background is in the arts. Now, we don't often connect the arts to, say, the corporate sector, but all of the training that I received in the arts, either by taking workshops or more importantly, by facilitating writing, acting, improv workshops, well, that had a huge effect on me being able to later translate into facilitating corporate workshops and doing seminars like this. So that's what stories can do. What makes up a story? Now, there are literally hundreds of components to a story. We've got a few up here. Often we think of story having a plot. We also think of the characters involved in that story, and we are going to discuss that later. Now, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of classic character tropes and combinations. Some classic ones include the person who's the ally to the main character or their opponent, the villain, as it were. And of course, the people that they care about the most. If we're thinking on more the plot side, there's a chronology or a narrative, although in modern storytelling, often we've started taking that chronology and playing with narratives in like a non-linear fashion. If you ever saw the movie Memento and were confused by it, you know what we're talking about. And then, of course, in complex stories, something like a movie or a novel, there's a central plot line, but often there's subplots for the secondary or even the tertiary characters. Now, are we going to be using that complex a story in our presentations? Probably not, but that's okay, because not every story needs to be complex. As a matter of fact, sometimes you can tell a story in a sentence or two. So, how do we go about doing that? Well, there's actually a structure. This is the story spine. Now, I've been teaching stories for over 25 years, and I find it remarkable that no matter where I've taught stories or had them taught to me, there's often a 5-point structure that's involved. They get the taglines might change, but there's basically beats that we want to hit in order to properly create that story that's going to have impact. So what are the 5 that we define at Talk Boutique? First is environment. Second is characters. Third is the issue, the conflict, or let's say if you're in business, because let's face it, a pitch is just another story. It might be about the opportunity. Then we have the importance or stakes of those issues, the conflict, the opportunities. Why do they matter? And then finally, an ending or an outcome or a conclusion. Now let's look at those in a little bit more detail. And the 2 that I really want you to pay attention to are actually the first 2. These tend to be the ones that we may not explore as much as we could when first telling stories. And yet they're massively important. We love to jump to number 3. We love to jump to what's it all about? What's the issue? Ooh, what's the opportunity? I'm going to tell you right away. And that's fine. But what we really want to do for our audiences, especially to engage them emotionally and pull them in, is we want to paint a picture of the world where this story takes place. So we start with environment. Now, what do I mean by environment? We could literally be describing the physical environment where a story takes place. I'm going to do that in a few seconds as an example. We also might be describing where the world is at that moment in time. You know, what is the current issue facing that world? What's the scenario? So it can also be a bit of a metaphysical thing. But the physical thing matters too. So here's an example about environment and then also characters. I was working with a client who worked for a big consulting company a couple of years ago, and they were doing a 15-minute presentation, and they were talking about helping companies move from 20th century sort of traditional business practices into the 21st century and updating their technology and things like that. In the middle of their presentation, they had 3 major points. Their second one was about embracing tech, especially exponential tech, things like artificial intelligence. And they had a case study where they talked about how they had worked with a client, a smaller client, on embracing artificial intelligence, AI, and getting them up to speed and how they initiated that. There were all kinds of different issues facing AI. One of the big ones involved trust, both at the corporate level, but also at a personal level. Their data was great. Their case study was actually quite strong. It was about 1.5 minutes long. It was very clear. I've been able to recount a couple of the things that they covered in that case study. But because it was in the middle of their presentation, we wanted to spice it up a little bit. So one of the questions I asked them when we came back after doing a rough draft was, where did this actually take place? How long were you with the client? Did you do it over video like we're doing now, or did you do it in person? And they said, well, actually, we went to their head offices. And I went, oh, great. How long were you there? We were there for a week. And I went, great. Where are their head offices? And they said, Saskatchewan. I went, oh, was it spring, summer, winter, or fall? And they chuckled and went, winter. And some of you might even be smiling right now, because winter in Saskatchewan is a pretty specific environment. I then asked, was there actually like a physical place where they had to do all this work? Because often if we go to a convention or if we're working with a client on site, we end up, and I got about this far in that explanation when they laughed again and went, small room, no windows. So they were in a small room with no windows in Saskatchewan in the middle of winter. And those of you listening have probably been inside that room, whether or not it was in Saskatchewan in winter. By the way, maybe it wasn't cold. Maybe you were in Dubai during the hottest part of their season. Maybe you were somewhere when the monsoons were hitting. Maybe it wasn't a small room with no windows. Maybe it was like you were on the 57th floor of an office tower, and when you looked out the window, you could see the far side of a great lake. But that environment has created that connection that we mentioned with the listeners. So then I got into the characters. Now, when we describe the people involved, especially in things like case studies, we'll describe the people involved, but we tend to be a little vague or broad. I already did it when I mentioned a client or the customers. That's a big one that we use, say, if you work in the financial sector. But if we can just get a little bit specific and make those people feel a little bit more like individuals. So I asked the person that I was working with, who had gone to Saskatchewan, was there anybody there that sort of popped up? Was there either something unique about the team? Maybe everybody on that team, they like to be social and go out afterwards, or they were extremely diligent and usually came in an hour early and worked an hour late. Or was there something specific about the individuals involved? And they said, you know what? Our main contact with that client, she had just moved from South America, Uruguay, 6 months before. And so before we even get into the case study, I've been told about how they went to Saskatchewan in the middle of winter and had to work with a woman who had just moved from South America, and now she was experiencing -30 temperatures for the first time. Now we've created empathy. We've all worked with that person in some way, shape, or form in that environment. So now that we've framed that world, it makes the issue or the conflict or the opportunity, the case study or the data or whatever it is, it humanizes it and it makes it pop. Now, when we get to number 3, I've spent quite a bit of time on environment and characters. Number 3 is actually that, remember that what, how, why that we talked about in session 1? This is where that what comes up. Sometimes the how and why, but especially that what. This is often one sentence. This might be the shortest part of your story spine. What is it all about? What's happening in this place? What's the opportunity or the issue that we need to overcome? Then we get into number 4. Now, in traditional storytelling, if this was a movie, number 4 might be 75% of the movie. It might be 74% of the novel. All right? It's the importance of what's going on. It's the stakes. In traditional narrative, we might raise the action. We might explore and heighten the history of the characters involved. In your presentations, this is usually where we get into the how do we know these things? How do they work? And the why especially. Why is it so important to the people doing the presentation and to you, the audience? And then finally, we want to end up with an ending that has an outcome or conclusion. We don't want to just be telling stories for the sake of telling stories. There should be some lesson. Again, if we're talking about traditional storytelling, this is where you put in the moral of the story. What we want is that key takeaway that the listeners to the story can literally take away and offer to other people so that that message, that idea spreads, and now we have impact. So that's the story spine. Environment, characters, issue, conflict, or opportunities, importance and stakes of that issue, conflict, or opportunity, and then the ending that has a clear outcome or conclusion, a lesson, or a takeaway. So we're going to be using this storytelling, and we're going to use this story spine for your homework. Here's how you're going to practice this. I want you to take that 1 to 2 minute story that you created after our first session. Now, when you told that story to somebody else, I bet you used some of that 5-point structure, but maybe you delved a little bit more into the characters and the people involved and spent a little bit less time on the environment. Or maybe it was reversed. I want you to take all 5 parts of that story spine and I want you to put them into your stories. And there's a couple of things I want you to do when you're doing that. 1, I want you to try and be specific as much as you can. All right. So it's not a tree, it's an oak, you know. It's not just a client or a customer, it's Rahim, who is fresh out of college and looking to pay off his student loans. Also, remember how I mentioned we want to engage the senses. So we often describe things as the way we can see them or the way we can hear them. But if you can engage the other 3 senses, if you can make people smell something or taste something, but especially if you can make people feel something. If I'm describing a forest, it's not just a forest, it's a cold, dank, dark forest. Now that's evocative. You often don't need a lot of extra words. You just need to get a little bit more specific with the language that you choose. Okay? So that's your assignment. We want you to take the story that you told before, now pepper it out. Don't, by the way, make it longer. Keep it 1 to 2 minutes, but use the story spine to make it stronger. All right? You're going to share that with someone else, and then you're going to bring that story to our group coaching session next week, and you're going to share that with the entire group. So that's what we're going to do going forward. So that's the end of our session 2. I hope you had a great time. I'm looking forward to seeing everybody in the group coaching. Andrea is going to be leading that next week. If you have any feedback for us, please go to the Slack channel and talk to us through the TalkBack Slack channel. You can communicate with us there. It has been my pleasure to take you through some storytelling and some storytelling structure. We'll see you next week. Stay safe, stay well.